Welcome to Synchronicity. Today we are speaking with Steve Taylor, and he is the author of The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening. And his previous books include The Calm Center, Out of the Darkness, and Waking from Sleep. He's a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University and one of Mind, Body, Spirit magazine's 100 most spiritually influential people, and he lives in Manchester, England. His website is stephenmtaylor.com. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Hi, Marie. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being with us. So, The Leap, the psychology of spiritual awakening. I think that we all kind of have our own personal definitions of what it means to be enlightened or spiritually awakened. So, what does that mean to you?
Well, I don't think of spiritual awakening as a particularly esoteric or extraordinary or even unusual state. I think it's a lot more common than most people realize. And there are also degrees of spiritual awakening. So a lot of people are probably at a less intense degree of awakening, and maybe not so many people at a very intense level of awakening. But basically, I interpret spiritual awakening as a more expansive state of being in which awareness is intensified and in which we transcend separation and experience connection, in which we become very present centered. So we live much less in the future and the past and much more in the present. And there are a lot of other characteristics, such as we experience a much lower degree of anxiety and psychological discord. Our minds are quieter. And there are a lot of characteristics, but I think those are the most common ones, the most important ones.
Thanks, Steve. I forgot to mention that your book, The Leap, is an Eckhart Tolle edition, and the foreword was done by Eckhart Tolle. I don't know if you're up to speed with what that means or if that's just something through your publisher, New World Library, but what's your awareness of Eckhart Tolle choosing your book to be in his edition?
Well, it was a great compliment because Eckhart chooses the books he wishes to publish himself. So I know him a little bit, and I met him 2, 3 years ago, and he told me that he was thinking of setting up this publishing imprint, and that he wanted to choose. Well, at first, initially, he chose a book of my spiritual poetic reflections called The Calm Center, which came out about 2 years ago, and then he told me he wanted to publish this book as well. So yeah, it's great to have Eckhart's endorsement. He's a great guy, and he's a great example of somebody who lives in a permanent state of spiritual wakefulness.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I was curious about that, if you presented the book to him and then he approved it, or he actually sought you out.
Yeah, well, as I say, I'm quite friendly with him. So yeah, he did tell me he's always been a great supporter of my books. So he told me that when he decided to start this imprint, I was one of the first authors he thought of. So he approached me and asked if he could publish my books.
Wow, very beautiful compliment. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, maybe we can talk about, Steve, since obviously if Eckhart thinks that this is important enough to publish under his own brand, uh, the reason why it's so important to talk about awakening, to teach the world about what it means to be awakened. Why do you think that's so important at this time right now?
Because I think that at the moment, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, that at the moment the human race is in quite a perilous predicament. There are all kinds of trends which are pointing towards problems, pointing towards potential catastrophes and crises in the future, like environmental breakdown, economic meltdown, political problems. And you could think about things like the decimation of other species and the overpopulation of the human race. So I think that we're at quite a crucial time in human history where we could either plunge towards destruction, or we could either um, shift into a new state of consciousness. And I think our survival as a species depends on us being able to shift collectively into a new state of being, because our present state of discord can't continue for much longer, and the inevitable endpoint of our present state of discord is probably catastrophe. But I think there are signs that we are undergoing a slow but steady collective shift, and I think what I call wakefulness, spiritual wakefulness, is becoming more common, and I think it's sort of picking up momentum and growing in its potential and its power. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this shift could occur over the next few decades.
Well, let's hope you're right.
Yeah.
um, One of the things, Steve, that I notice is, and I think everyone who's listening to this show has at least some intention or desire for not only personal wakefulness, but also a global awakening. But when I look at what is happening in the world, and it's not like problems are a new thing. I mean, since the
Mm,
dawn of time, survival has been a struggle. No matter what species you are, that we all go through life and struggle and death and loss. But it seems like, from my personal experience, that seeing all of this, rather than pushing me toward awakening, is just triggering more fear than ever before. And I'm wondering,
mm.
what do you do about that? It's like, if my intention is to awaken, but I'm going on the opposite end of the spectrum because it's so important to awaken,
Hmm.
it's kind of a stuck place.
Yeah. But at the same time, awakening happens through crises. It happens through challenge. When life is easy and when life is stable and when life is full of contentment, it feels great, but it can also be quite a static state to be in. It can be a state in which we kind of we don't fulfill our true potential, in which we don't grow, or in which we don't develop. But when we face challenges, when we face negativity, then it forces us to go deeper into ourselves. It forces us to uncover our latent strengths and potentials. So that's why the world is going through crises, but I think these crises and all this negativity in itself, that is probably having an awakening effect, because it's enabling us to develop more resilience, to develop more strengths, and it's enabled us to connect together. You know, when people face crises, they connect in ways which they don't normally when life is easy. So that's why even the negativity in the world, that can be cause for optimism as well.
Hmm. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about some of the different types of wakefulness, because that is an important part of your book, The Leap. Right now, we are speaking with Steve Taylor. He is the author of The Leap, the psychology of spiritual awakening, and it is an Eckhart Tolle edition. So Eckhart wrote the foreword for this book and endorsed it because it is such an important book when it comes to awakening. So, Steve, what are the three different types of wakefulness?
Well, some people, maybe a small minority of people, are naturally awake. So natural wakefulness is the first type of wakefulness. So these are people who they don't follow any spiritual practices or paths, and they don't undergo any sudden moment of transformation. They just are naturally awake. It's just their normal, innate state. And these people, they don't usually become spiritual teachers or spiritual authors. They most frequently become artists, creative artists. They're often poets. So maybe some examples are, the American poet Walt Whitman. He's a great example of a naturally awakened person. English poets like William Wordsworth, William Blake, and also a lot of painters, like Monet, the French painter, the Impressionists, Van Gogh. So a lot of creative artists are naturally awakened people, and their wakefulness is the inspiration of their art, and they describe their states of wakefulness in their poems, or they depict it in their paintings. Or sometimes naturally wakeful people become idealists, or they give their lives to social causes. A great example of that is Florence Nightingale, the famous nurse who founded the profession of nursing and set up thousands of hospitals, hundreds of hospitals, and brought about a lot of social reforms in health and sanitation. So she was actually a very spiritually awakened person. She wrote books about Christian mysticism later in her life. So she was a great example of a naturally awakened person who was an idealist. So the second group the second type of wakefulness is gradual wakefulness. Maybe that's the most common form because there are millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people in the world who are following paths of gradual wakefulness. They're following spiritual practices, spiritual paths. They're meditating. They're doing yoga. They're following the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, or the path of the Kabbalah or Sufism. So through following these paths and practicing these spiritual techniques, they're slowly and gradually moving towards wakefulness over years and decades. And the third type is sudden and dramatic wakefulness. And that usually occurs in the context of intense psychological turmoil. So it's often when people are diagnosed with cancer, or when they suffer a bereavement, or maybe they are alcoholics or drug addicts, or maybe they're just suffering from intense depression or intense anxiety. And what normally happens is that in the midst of their intense turmoil, they reach a point where they feel as though they've lost everything, when they've hit rock bottom, and all of the things which give them identity or well-being have been taken away. And when that happens, it's as if the normal ego dies off or dissolves away, and a new self suddenly emerges in its place. So it's almost like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, or a phoenix rising from the ashes, that suddenly a new spiritually awakened self is born inside them.
Thank you, Steve. You mentioned, there's so many questions that I have just based on what you've shared there. You've mentioned meditation, and you also mentioned depression and anxiety and crises, and how sometimes these crises can trigger awakening. And I'm wondering, I just have been trying to meditate more often, and when I do get into a regular meditation practice, what I notice is that my physical symptoms of anxiety are actually greatly exacerbated. And so then I feel like, and not just while I'm in the meditation, but throughout the day, and it will even last for a couple of weeks after just one meditation session, as an example.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Whereas normally I can function without, like, the worries are there, but my heart isn't pounding. I'm not having panic attacks. And I'm just wondering, with the work that you do, maybe you have some advice for people who want to awaken, they want to practice meditation, but I know that I'm not the only person who suffers from this, that it actually, and maybe it's because I'm more aware, so it's more obvious.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard other people say that it's not an uncommon phenomenon. And yeah, I think that meditation is sometimes quite a severe practice. And if you do have a lot of psychological turmoil, if you have a lot of latent anxiety, a lot of worries, a lot of stress in your mind, then to suddenly sit down and close your eyes in silence and start meditating, it just means that you confront the turmoil in your mind in a more naked state. So, and once you confront the turmoil, your attention can actually make it grow. Whereas if you decided to read a book or watch TV, if you distracted yourself, the turmoil would still be there, but it wouldn't be exacerbated. But your attention exacerbates it. And unless you can actually focus on your mantra or your breathing or whatever technique you're using, then maybe the turmoil will start to fade away. But maybe the turmoil is so great that you just can't focus on your mantra or your breathing. So the advice I sometimes give people is that meditation in itself may not be the right practice for them. So I sometimes recommend meditative activities rather than meditation itself, because there are a lot of activities which have a powerful meditative effect without actually being meditation in the normal sense. So I'm thinking of activities like swimming, running, walking in the countryside, doing yoga, or even just listening to music quietly in peaceful surroundings. So all of those activities have a meditative effect, where they all have the effect of quietening the mind, and they all have the effect of tuning into a deeper level of harmony within ourselves. So if you do have a lot of trouble going on in your life, if you know that there's a lot of latent anxiety in your mind, then I would recommend following a meditative activity rather than meditation itself.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Because I feel like, yes, noticing, I mean, it's not that I'm unable to focus on the breath or the mantra, because I am. I
Mm.
can, depending on the day, basically clear my mind and just focus on the present moment. But that's when the awareness of other things that aren't even thought based come up.
Mm.
Just that awareness of the body
Mm.
starts it. So I like the just the being the mindful activities.
Yeah, I mean, mindfulness is it's a great form of active meditation. I mean, some spiritual teachers like Krishnamurti, for example, used to criticize people who meditated for saying, because he said that you're separating meditation from life itself. You know, you're setting aside half an hour or an hour to distance yourself from everyday life, but really you should practice meditation every moment of your life, as often as you can. You know, because household chores are. I've been doing this recently myself. Actually, I've been sort of doing household chores mindfully, and even if I open the cupboard in the kitchen, or even I pick up a saucepan, or I fill a saucepan with pasta or something like that, you can do it in a sort of careful, mindful way when you feel the handle of the saucepan or the door of the cupboard, and that kind of mindful activity, that even that has a very harmonizing effect. Even that creates a sense of inner peace, and it creates a sense of connectedness to your experience. And I think even that kind of practice is sometimes more beneficial than the meditation itself.
Thank you. I know that that is going to help a lot of people. Steve, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to add about that topic?
Um, well, I mean, walking is great as well. I've been practicing this recently myself too. That when you walk, it's great to just bring your attention into your limbs and your feet. And it's great to feel your feet sort of caressing the ground and the muscles that you use in your feet. And um, it's great to feel your body moving through the air. And it's great to be aware of your surroundings too, rather than sort of being immersed in thoughts within your own consciousness. You just gently give your attention to your surroundings, to the sky above you and the people around you, at the same time as being aware of your feet as they stroke the pavement. And if anybody tries that, they'll immediately notice a kind of harmonizing effect. They'll immediately notice a sense of connectedness to their experience and a sense of well-being, a kind of gentle, subtle sense of well-being developing inside them.
Thanks, Steve. That it reminds me of, which is something important to remember, I think, is that there are so many things that we can choose to be mindful of. I mean, we have infinite number of stimuli going on in the world, whether they're thoughts in our head or our heartbeat or our feet, footsteps on the ground. And we can't focus on all of them at once. We get to choose what we want to mindfully place our attention on.
Yeah, well, it's sometimes interesting to switch to different senses. I sometimes do this as a practice in workshops with my students, where maybe we're walking through the woods. We go outside and walk through the woods, and we begin with sight. So we concentrate on being mindful through sight, and then after 2 minutes, I say smell. So then we switch our attention to smell for 2 minutes. And then I say hearing. So we switch our attention to listening to the sounds around us. And yeah, so you're right. It's difficult to be aware of more than one sense at the same time. But at the end of this exercise, once we've done the 5 senses, and we also do walking as well. So then I ask them to try to be mindful of all these things at the same time. And once you've cultivated mindfulness through each sense, then it does sometimes become possible to be to be mindful in a multiple sensory way. So that I think it can that can work sometimes if you're still enough.
Thanks, Steve. Again, we are speaking with Steve Taylor. He is the author of The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening. And you can find his website at stephenmtaylor.com. Now, Stephen, you have a background in psychology, but you seem to look at spiritual awakening different than many other psychologists who study the brain. So I am curious to know if you think that awakening requires, let's say, someone who has a very anxious personality type or a lot of worries, like we were talking about earlier, does that person need to rewire their brain in order to become more awakened?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that awakening happens. It's obviously linked to brain activity, but I think the awakening itself is primary. I think if somebody experiences awakening or they have a temporary awakening experience, then that experience brings changes to the brain. It's the same way if you were, if you were in a forest and a wild animal suddenly leaps out in front of you, maybe a lion or a bear, then you get a surge of adrenaline through your body. All kinds of hormones are released related to fear, and that will definitely change your brain activity. And awakening's a bit like that. I think the awakening experience happens in itself, and then it brings changes to brain chemistry or to brain activity. And there were a lot of studies of long-term meditators, Tibetan monks who've been meditating for decades, and brain scans show that their brain functioning is very significantly different from ordinary people's. So they have a lot more activity in the parts of the brain linked to contentment and serenity, and less activity in the parts of the brain, linked to anxiety and fear. So that kind of illustrates that long-term spiritual practice and the experience of enlightenment brings changes to brain activity.
It'd be interesting to look more closely at the brains of people who've had the third type of wakefulness that came from a crisis, that big awakening, and to see what kind of changes happen in their brain.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Maybe I'll think about a research project on that. If I can persuade people to step into brain scanning machines, it could be interesting. But I think, I think it would be very similar actually, based on my interviews with people who've undergone spiritual awakening and based on my own experience. There is a lot less anxiety. I mean, I don't think, I think it's a bit of the myth to think that awakened people live in a state of continual bliss. And it's a bit of a myth to think that they're completely free of anxiety and all difficulties. But they're definitely more free of anxiety, and they definitely have an intensified sense of well-being. So I assume that those things would show up in brain scans.
Thanks, Steve. So maybe we can talk a little bit about, you've talked in your book a bit about spiritual teachers who appear to have been awakened at one point, but then they kind of their egos start to take over again because they've got all these followers, and they maybe start
Mm.
taking things for granted or taking advantage of people. When so it could be a case of either they've always been just frauds from the start, or they genuinely had this awakened experience, but something along the way changed. So can we talk
Mm.
about what goes on there in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, as you say, I think there are some spiritual teachers who maybe they're just complete narcissists, or maybe they're just pure charlatans. Maybe they're purposely exploiting people for money or for fame or power. But I think there are a lot of awakened people who become teachers and who are initially, very purely awakened and very ethically pure people, but they may become corrupted by the adulation of their followers and by the power and the authority of their position. And that happens fairly regularly. And I think the problem is that when one undergoes an awakening, it doesn't necessarily wipe the slate clean, so to speak. So it doesn't necessarily wipe away all of your personality defects or all of your neuroses and some of your personality tendencies or characteristics will linger on. And the problem is if a person becomes a spiritual teacher straight away or fairly soon after their awakening, there's not enough time for these personality defects or characteristics to fade away. So they normally do fade away in time. But if a person becomes a spiritual teacher fairly early on, and they still have a lingering tendency for maybe self-indulgence or a kind of desire for power or self-esteem or narcissism, then the adulation of their followers, the kind of the unobjective, um, admiration of their followers, it can distort their self-image. It can make them believe that they're behaving ethically even when they exploit people. And they may be it could be that they begin to sexually exploit their followers, financially exploit their followers, or it could mean that they become intoxicated by power and set themselves apart from their followers and believe that they are avatars and saviors of the human race. So I think that's a problem, that people become spiritual teachers too soon after their awakening.
Thank you, Steve. So, one of the aspects of awakening is this separation from the need for so much material stuff or success or to build.
Mm.
But yet there are some spiritual teachers who are quite wealthy, and one would say, well, if why not just give all of that away to charity? I mean, where is the balance? Because the more wealth someone is able to accumulate in this world, the more
Mm.
potential influence they could have, whether that's a positive or a negative influence. So where's the balance?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it would be great if wealthy spiritual teachers give their money away, and maybe they do. I mean, who are we to say? I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe Deepak Chopra, Eckhart Tolle, hopefully they do give a lot of money away. We can't really say, but there's definitely a tendency to be less interested in accumulating power and wealth. There's usually a shift from materialism to to a desire to contribute. It's a shift from a desire to accumulate things to a desire to contribute things. So somebody described it as moving from wanting to take things from the world to wanting to give things to the world. So a lot of people become not people. I'm not thinking of spiritual teachers here, but I'm thinking of ordinary people who become awakened. A lot of them turn away from professional kind of high status positions and careers that they had before. So they often give up their jobs and become, take on altruistic roles. They become counselors, therapists, teachers, charity workers, kind of social reformers. So that's very common. But again, I think the role of spiritual teacher can distort some of the characteristics of wakefulness.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. I am still curious about this financial aspect because there can be the desire to not need so many material things while also living in the reality that we're in. It is very difficult to function in the world without having some kind of income.
Oh yeah, that's true. I mean, I think there is a balance because I mean, occasionally people say to me, they say things like, why don't you give your books away for free, and why do you charge money for online courses? And I sometimes say, well, it's either that or working at McDonald's, or it's either that or working in a garage. Because in this world, in this economic system, we do have to have some means of keeping ourselves financially afloat, and we have we have to have some means of paying the mortgage, of feeding the kids. So it's totally unrealistic to think that you can be completely free of financial concerns. But it's a question of balance. It's a question of need. I'm happy to earn enough money, all the money I need, but I don't really care about earning more than that. If I mean, my books they don't sell particularly large quantities, but if they did, if I was selling millions of copies of my books, then I hope that I would, I would give a lot of money away. All the money I didn't need, I hope I would give it away.
Mm-hmm. But then when once we get to a new level of economics, we start to see how things that we might not have needed before feel like we need now. So,
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you have that desire, if you have the impulse to accumulate, maybe that could happen. But I think if you don't have the impulse to accumulate, if you know that well-being is not dependent on material possessions, if you know that well-being is not dependent on success or power, then you don't have the desire to accumulate things just for the sake of it. I think some people, maybe people who have not undergone spiritual development, they're caught in this endless cycle of wanting. They want more and more, and they believe that once they get certain things, they'll be satisfied. But if they do get those things, it just creates more desires, and they just move on and on. It's a kind of treadmill. But hopefully, spiritually awakened people would not be on that treadmill.
Steve, that's interesting because I kind of feel like, from what I've heard from other people, often that has been the catalyst for people's awakening as they keep building and building and they get to where they think they have it all and they realize they still feel awful, and that
Mm.
is why they start seeking out ways to awaken, because they realize that this accumulation is not the answer.
Yeah, that's true. In a way, it's the classic syndrome of the midlife crisis. The midlife crisis occurs when a person has kind of lived the dream of material success, and they've spent most of their life accumulating things, and maybe they've reached a position of status, and maybe they've accumulated some wealth, and they've got everything they should need, which should make them happy. But still, they feel this terrible, gnawing discontent inside them. And unfortunately, some people turn to alcohol or maybe medication to get them through it. But other people, they realize that something's wrong. They realize that they've been looking for happiness in the wrong place. They've been looking for happiness in the external world, and they realize that it's not really there, that it's an illusion. So maybe then that's when they turn inside. They just sort of turn around and look in the reverse direction. And hopefully they begin to realize that, yeah, there is a well-being inside me. There's a much more stable, a much more deep-rooted kind of happiness, which I can attain by working on myself, by following spiritual practices. And when they do that, then immediately the desire to accumulate things begins to fall away, and immediately people begin this new, fantastic adventure of spiritual development.
Thanks, Steve. We are speaking right now with Steve Taylor. He is the author of The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening, and you can find him at stephenmtaylor.com. Now, Steve, can we talk a little bit about children and
Hmm.
their awakeness? What kind of research have you done on the the perspective that children have?
Hmm. Well, it really came first of all from having my own children. I've got three young kids. The oldest is 13, the youngest is 7. And when you have young kids, you realize that they do live in a naturally awakened state. In some ways, they have this natural quality of spiritual enlightenment, and it's a great adventure to be, the parent of young kids, because it's like becoming a child again yourself. You see the world again through their eyes, and you realize how freshly and how vividly they perceive the world around them, and how nothing that they see or touch or feel is mundane. Everything is miraculous and wonderful. And they feel a sense of awe at all kinds of ordinary, everyday things. So it's great that you experience that again yourself as a parent. And even something like mindfulness, so that when you're with a young child, you realize that they are totally present. They're totally mindful of their experience. So if they're walking somewhere, they're continually stopping to pick up things and to look around them and to take in the reality of their experience. So it's a great lesson. Children become spiritual teachers. I felt that my kids were spiritual teachers for me. And I mean, I'm not saying that children live in a state of equanimity and serenity and bliss, because every parent knows that too. That in fact, I sometimes say that young children are a combination of enlightened spiritual beings and narcissistic monsters, which is also true of some spiritual teachers, by the way. But but yeah, there are definitely some ways in which children have a natural quality of spiritual enlightenment.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about what you call the fall, because it seems to have happened to all of humanity. And then on an individual basis, it seems to happen to children where they're in this state of presence because they don't have labels and they're not automated to, they don't have autopilot for the world yet. But as that develops, that presence and mindfulness starts to fall away. So, can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. There's definitely a parallel between what happened to us collectively as a species and what happens to us individually as we develop from children into adulthood. And in terms of our species, the fall was it was an event which led to a greater sense of separation, a greater sense of individuality. People became much more ego-centered and much more separate from the world around them, and also separate to their own bodies. People began to see themselves as kind of egos which lived inside their bodies. And people in general became more individualistic and less empathic. And that led to, an intensification of warfare, of hierarchical societies, the oppression of women. Because there's a lot of evidence that sort of prehistoric human beings were largely peaceful, very little warfare, and they were very non-hierarchical and very egalitarian. Women had high status and so forth. So I think some of the world's indigenous peoples didn't experience this. And that's why indigenous peoples always seem so different to kind of modern Westerners or modern European or modern Americans, because a lot of indigenous peoples, like the Native Americans or the Australian Aborigines, they retained that kind of early human state of non-separation and connectedness, and that sense of the aliveness of the world around them, and that sense of connection to the world around them. But when we undergo development as individuals, when we reach the age of maybe 11, 12, 13, then the ego starts to develop. A sense of individuality begins to become stronger, and thought chatter starts to appear in our minds, and we begin to experience ourselves as beings which live inside our heads in duality from the world. And that seems to be a natural process. I think it's exacerbated by social conditioning and by the social systems we live in and by education, by the attitude of parents and the attitude of teachers. But it's definitely, to some degree, it seems to be a natural process that we lose the openness and presence of young children, and we sort of fall into an ego-based consciousness. So I think that spiritual development means transcending that separateness. And so to a large extent, it means regaining the openness and the presence and the vivid perception that we experience as children. So it's a bit like a full circle.
Mm. When you were talking about the fall and what happened to us as humans and how we began to be more separate and more ego-based, I kind of thought, well, isn't that what our humanity is, that thinking part of the brain? But then when you brought it back to indigenous people, obviously their brains are just as human as anyone else's, yet they haven't, well, until they were exposed to us, they
Mm.
they haven't had that same problem
Mm.
of being so rooted in the ego, and they have been more in touch with nature and just more connected to all that is. And so I'm just wondering why that separation happens so strongly in what we would call Western society.
Well, I mean, I wrote a book called The Fall about 10 years ago, which is exactly about this issue. And there's a lot of evidence that this shift occurred in historical terms. It began around 6,000 years ago in certain groups of human beings who lived in the Middle East and Central Asia. You can actually trace the sort of cultural changes these people underwent and how they developed a new sense of individuality and how this led to warfare and male domination and even monotheistic or theistic religions. But as to why it happened, it's a bit more difficult to pinpoint a reason. But it seems to be connected in some way with environmental changes which occurred, because these areas of the Middle East and Central Asia, they underwent a process of desertification at that time, where lands became very arid and it became much more difficult for them to survive in these areas. So they seemed to develop a new sense of individuality to help them survive, because life became so much more difficult and life seemed to favor a new kind of selfishness. Survival seemed to favor a new kind of selfishness and a lack of empathy. So that seems to be, that's the most obvious reason as to why it could have occurred.
It's interesting how it seems like our evolution is almost what has been responsible for what, like, now it feels like we're almost devolving with what's
Yeah,
happening with the planet.
yeah. You could say that, but in some ways, there are grounds for pessimism. There are also grounds for optimism. I mean, if we went back to, say, 17th century Europe and we experienced life at that time, we would be horrified by the brutality which people show to one another, by the lack of empathy for people, by the harsh punishments, by the low status of women, by the divisions of different classes and castes in society. Life was incredibly cruel and brutal and unfair and undemocratic. But if you jump forward to the 20th century, then everything's changed. There are lots of positive developments. There's a much greater sense of compassion, a much greater sense of respect for nature, for other people. Not in everybody, but in some sections of society. A lot greater respect for for disenfranchised groups like disabled people, and other. Well, think in terms of animals, a greater respect for the rights of animals, a greater respect for the rights of all different groups in society. And we're used to these things; they seem normal to us, but they're a massive social development, massive cultural development compared to 300 or 400 years ago. So in The Fall, I just try to suggest that over the last 300 or 400 years, these social and cultural developments have been occurring, which show that we're transcending separation to some degree, that we're developing more compassion, and in fact that we're undergoing a kind of slow very gradual spiritual awakening. And that's still continuing now. That's intensified, if anything, over the last few decades. And I think, over the last 20 years, one of the biggest cultural changes in the world has been the massive interest in self-development and spiritual development, which in itself is a sign of our collective awakening. So in that sense, there are grounds for optimism. But I think a lot of the negative developments in the world, you can see them as a kind of resistance to the positive developments. Usually when a new phase begins in history or in social development, when a new phase is beginning, the characteristics of the previous phase, they try to become more rigid because they feel that they are being threatened. So they kind of try to entrench themselves and become stronger. And I think that's what's happening in the world at the moment, that there's this kind of upsurge of nationalism and protectionism because, people who have nationalistic tendencies, they feel threatened by this rising tide of collectivism. So I think basically the characteristics of human beings' sleep consciousness are being threatened by the slowly increasing wakefulness. So those old characteristics are trying to kind of reaffirm themselves because they feel threatened.
Mm-hmm. So what do the people who are kind of in the middle, who see the awakening, they want to be part of it, but they're also stuck in fear, and they're kind of like, well, which way do I go? What do those people do?
Well, it's tricky because a lot of people have awakening impulses to awaken, but they live in a culture which maybe doesn't support those impulses, or maybe they don't even understand them because a lot of people who undergo awakening suddenly and dramatically in the midst of psychological turmoil, they don't have a background in spiritual practices or paths. So initially, they don't understand what's happened to them. And even a lot of people who are naturally awakened, they live in cultures which don't understand wakefulness or spirituality. So they feel confused. They don't understand themselves. And it takes them quite a long time to understand and accept themselves. And that was true in my case. I was somebody who was probably naturally awakened from an early age, but because I lived in a kind of working class environment, it was very difficult for me to understand myself or accept myself. So for a long time, I thought there was something wrong with me because I was so different to other people. It took me several years before I began to read books about spirituality, before I discovered meditation, and then I had a framework to make sense of my own wakefulness. So I think there are probably millions of people around the world who have the impulse to awaken, or who maybe already have awakened, but they don't really understand themselves because their culture doesn't support spirituality. But I think that as with the internet and maybe with shows like yours and all of the interest in spirituality on the internet and sort of the burgeoning fame of people like Eckhart Tolle and the Dalai Lama, spirituality is becoming more widely known. So I think it's slowly becoming easier for people to understand their own spirituality. And I think, that will happen. That will grow more and more over the next few years, the next few decades, so that it will become a lot easier for people with awakening impulses to accept those impulses and allow them to express themselves.
Hmm. Thank you, Steve. We have been speaking with Steve Taylor. He is the author of many books, but the one we've been mostly talking about today is The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening. And you can find Steve at his website, stephenmtaylor.com, and that's Stephen with a V. Now, we are almost out of time, Steve, but this has been such a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for the work that you're doing. What do you want to make sure that people take away from this discussion today?
Well, I'll make just one final comment. And I think there are many people in the world who are caught up in anxiety and discord, who feel unhappy, who have a sense that somehow things are not quite right in their lives or not quite right in themselves. And, many people spend their whole lives caught up in this discord. And what I would say is that you could compare the human mind or the human being to the ocean. So on the surface of the ocean, there's always some degree of discord. You know that you have the foaming and swelling of the waves. You have the roar of the waves, and it can seem quite turbulent on the surface. But if you go just a few meters below the surface, suddenly you're plunged into stillness and quietness and harmony. And that stretches all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, miles and miles down to the bottom of the ocean. And I think that the human mind is like that beneath the turbulence, which is sometimes on the surface, if you just go a little bit beneath that, suddenly you're in the midst of the natural well-being and stillness of our nature. So that natural well-being is always there, just below the surface. And if you can just tap into it for a short time when you're meditating, when you're walking in the countryside, when you're doing yoga, or when you're swimming, then once you know that it's there, then it gives you a great trust and a great faith. And you always know that you can dive back into it, whenever you feel caught up in the turbulence again.
That was a beautiful analogy. Thank you so much. And just listening to you say that made me feel more centered.
Good.
So
Great.
thank you for that. Well, it has been such a pleasure, Steve. Thank you so much for your time. Again, we've been speaking with Steve Taylor. You can find him at stephenmtaylor.com. And the name of the book is The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening. Thanks so much for your time, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for listening. Thank you